Hi everybody, my name is Adi Kyogun. My study is entitled Evaluating Localization of Urban Planning Initiatives, although this topic has long since changed. So now to the promise of localization. I'll start off by sharing what sort of led to this study. I was looking at the development plans across Africa. So here's a collage of some of them. There are a lot. And even some, development planning, strategic development planning is something that has been very popular. And one struck out to me, the Lagos State Development Plan. I think it struck out to me partly because it was one of the earliest, most recent at the time of my study. Also because I think it's, I would argue, one of the more ambitious of these plans. It's a 30-year plan. It has over 400 initiatives. And like many of the other plans you see, it was constructed by the Ministry of Economic Budgeting and Planning. But in this case, there was also a technical advisory committee that was sort of made up of civil society organizations and private sector consultants. And why this was particularly interesting was that this plan embodies a promise to reduce exposure to international capital, because international capital tends to come with its own logics. The plan also, the governor in the plan says that they want to embody, or they want to plan to sort of have the future of the state in the hands of the state. But at the same time, we also have declarations by the governor saying that we need long-term private sector financing to address the challenge of water in the city, and this is made to an audience of international development organizations and banks. And so this contradiction that we see here is quite reminiscent of a quote that I think I find quite interesting. Louis Sarr, in his book Afrotopia, talks about the contemporary African being torn between a tradition that he no longer truly feels attached to and a modernity that has befallen him like a destructive and dehumanizing force. And I think this tearing apart is at the center of the discourse on localization and globalization in development planning. So you may ask, what is localization? Some definitions are there. This is by the OECD and this is by UN Habitat. For UN Habitat, they try to think of it as transposing global agendas into municipal organizations and structures. I use this graphic to sort of illustrate the metaphor or the irony of that, where you have this sort of vision and sort of how does it translate to the reality. And of course, many scholars do disagree with this framing of localization, the foremost of which I would say is George Vallandier, who has inspired these sort of movements, radical post-colonial movements. For them, they see, localization to be a point of resistance against external influence and protection of local values. And it's at those points of resistance that new forms of self-expression is created. I think on the other end of the spectrum, we have theorists like Jan Pedersen, saying that development is intrinsically intercultural and you cannot do away with those exchanges and flow. And again, you have some scholars that sort of run with this idea of hybridity, relationality. So to step back, the scenario we're finding ourselves in is in Lagos. How do these plans then embody the idea of localization, where in a setting where you have this huge gap in water supply, or look at the investment gap in the water sector, and we have international organizations, the so-called external actors, saying stuff like the Lagos State Water Corporation will never saturate the market, it never has, and it never will. And so this sort of informed the questions that I sort of held on as I went into the study, trying to understand how localization is conceived in the water initiatives of the plan. Does it inherently have this promise of localization? And how does this then affect the initiatives that come forward? And then does that promise resonate with the epistemologies of the local, the people, the everyday people in the city? And so I started at the center of this study, I sort of situated in the center of the study with my unit of analysis being the Lagos State Development Plan, product in charge of the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources, and they sort of introduced me to the host of different stakeholders that have been involved in executing the plan, transforming it, operationalizing it. And what I did find was a sort of historical perspective or narrative that was given to me. In the state, there's this transition of different modes of planning, or approaches to planning. In the early colonial times, we had these grand designs on public health works for the water system. In the 1970s, you have the World Bank coming on the scene to bring about this technocratic approach to master planning. And I think currently we're at the end stages of what many will call strategic urban management that consists of communicative planning, participatory approaches. And I think we're heading towards somewhere from this plan. I don't know the name to call it yet. So I'm still workshopping this. So I call it pragmatic synergies. I think there are two main things that constitute this, where we're heading. I think we have this idea of compounding rationalities and an enlightened pragmatism. And I will share briefly what these sort of mean. With compounding rationalities, so this sort of shows you the current situation of Lagos water sector. You have the water treatment plants and water stations, and you can see that access is very limited. Some people put the estimate of access to be about 5% of a city of 24 million people. And these are the current infrastructure. And this sort of shows you the sort of rationale that has dominated for a long time. This centralized form of delivery, where you have these large water stations that sort of deliver water to different communities. But what we are seeing now, as I said, is sort of an emerging trend. What I've seen is, with the most recent policy on water, for the first time ever, there is a consideration of informal service providers. This is something that has not been seen since the World Bank came on the scene. And it's at this point of the inclusion of community water organizations and informal service providers that I see a sort of convergence of rationalities, this blurring of the boundary between what we call formal and informal. So here, I think this is a plan produced by a community with some civil society organization and private sector actors. So this plan is sort of shows you where certain ideologies about inclusion of the informal service providers comes from. There are three explainers that I see in the field. Again, so we have the civil society organizations and some private sector consultants. Those that came up with those community plans, they are working on the development plan of the state, sort of bringing those rationalities. We have institutional memory, I would say institutional trauma of past failures in the water sector, where you see state actors saying that there's really nothing we can do about the situation, so we have to resort to what works. And this is sort of also explaining, another explainer being the extreme resource scarcity, where you see the state government saying that even if it's someone that pushes a water cart, as long as it provides water, let us have it. And on the other hand, I'm seeing the emergence of enlightened pragmatism. What this looks like is there's a sort of refraction of pragmatism, because if you look at this map, you see the different kinds of community-led initiatives for water. They are sort of spatially clustered, whereas some certain typologies you see here, some here, and here on the Lekki Peninsula, you don't see any community-led initiative. I think this is a consequence of the geography, saline intrusion at that region. And if you zoom in on some of these community initiatives, this is an example of one in the Oroshoki community. I think it borders on ideologies of people as infrastructure. Nikhil Anand talks about hydraulic citizenship. And we're seeing this play out in this form of enlightened pragmatism, where communities are the resources that distribute water in the city. And I think in those community-led initiatives, there is a greater sensitivity to people and processes. For example, the state's approach to community participation, for example, would be we set up a canopy and we tell people to come to us to hear what we're trying to do. Whereas in community-led initiatives, there is this idea that different communities are different, so you have to shift your approach based on where you're coming from. And I think in those community-led initiatives, there is an economy of trust, or a currency of trust and reciprocity that is beyond just financial gaps and financial terms. And I think these are some of the values that define those economies of trust. I think what these all speaks to are some theories of change that I think are relevant for this study. So we have adaptive governance, we have co-production in governance, Elena Ostrom being one of the. So, I think at this point I'd like to talk about what is at stake. What is at stake here with this study is this is a quote by Franz Fanon. I find this quite interesting. He says, "So, comrades, let us not pay tribute to the Europeans by creating states that are mere, grotesque emulation." He says, if we want to transform Africa into Europe, we just hand it over to the Europeans. But if we want to take it to the next level, we must be pioneers, we must innovate. And I think this sort of leads me to where I'm at now. I think tomorrow there is a presentation about where this is heading. This Nectica is a platform that I've imagined to create platforms for communities to connect with designers and innovators, sort of bridge local knowledge and technical expertise and connect to these larger state initiatives for innovation and pioneering. I have this barcode. Please scan it if you want to give feedback because we have limited time on my presentation. Thank you.